Hello everyone, welcome to an introduction to JavaScript with jQuery. This video is intended for anyone who's interested in learning about web design and front-end web development. Perhaps you're already familiar with HTML and CSS, but it feels like there's something missing from your pages and applications. Well, you're absolutely correct. What's missing is JavaScript. And in this video, we are going to learn the role that JavaScript plays in front-end web development, and we'll also take a look at how to write our own code using jQuery to add JavaScript functionality to our pages. So let's dive right in. In front of you is a sample page that I've created, and really quickly I want to dissect the different technologies that make this page possible. So for example, we know that HTML is involved. HTML is how we include our content on the page and define that content. It's how we say that this bit of text should be a heading and this bit of text should be a paragraph. We know that CSS is involved. CSS is how we give this box a background color and this colored border and a precise font size and weight. So in a word, CSS is style. But there's something else at play on this page. So for example, if we click this X that's attached to the box disappears. If we scroll down a bit and click on one of these frequently asked questions, we see that an answer slides down. So that's not content and it's not style. It's behavior. And JavaScript is how we add behavior to our pages. JavaScript is how we make our pages and applications come alive. It's the glue that holds everything together, and it's the magic that lets us manipulate anything we want at any moment. So let's get a little bit more specific before we dive straight into the code. Here are the 4 primary things that we use JavaScript for. Number 1, event handling. This basically means that at a certain moment, we want something specific to happen. The event could be anything. Perhaps it's on the initial page load. Perhaps it's when the page gets resized. Maybe it's when the user taps or clicks something, or when the user swipes something, or when the user scrolls to a certain point on the page. Any event you can imagine, with JavaScript, we can capture the moment that that event takes place and then run certain code. Number 2, DOM traversal. That phrase likely doesn't make sense if you're new to JavaScript, so here's a quick breakdown. We know that the word traversal just means traveling or navigating your way around, and the phrase DOM stands for Document Object Model. Now, discussing the DOM could take 30-40 hours if we're talking about really understanding it in detail. So here's a really quick, unscientific explanation of the DOM. In HTML, we can think of the elements almost as Russian stacking dolls, the way that a paragraph nests inside a list item, which nests inside an unordered list, which nests inside an article, so on and so forth. Well, the DOM is basically that times 1,000 or 10,000. Think of a room in a house and a hoarder lives in that room, and they have 100,000 different sets of Russian stacking dolls. The DOM is basically the family tree in a line graph, documenting all of those Russian stacking doll families and all of their details and abilities. Basically, the DOM is everything that the browser is capable of and is currently rendering, and it's just sort of the totality of the web browser. That still isn't very helpful at the moment, but just know that JavaScript lets us move around the DOM and do all sorts of neat things. So moving on, number 3 is DOM manipulation. So if we know that the DOM is sort of this giant family tree of everything on the page and everything the browser can do, you can imagine how useful it is to be able to manipulate that family tree, to manipulate the DOM. And JavaScript makes it possible. Number 4 is AJAX. AJAX basically means anytime you send or receive data without refreshing the page. It's as simple as that. So JavaScript and especially jQuery make all 4 of these things very simple. So let's take a look at the code and dive right in. Now in front of you are 2 windows. On the left, we see a text editor with the code that creates the sample web page that we looked at a few minutes ago. And on the right is a web browser showing that sample page. So in this tab, we can see the JavaScript is in play. You can close the different modules and toggle down different answers and questions. But in this tab, I've removed the JavaScript. This is only HTML and CSS. We're going to rewrite the JavaScript together to add that functionality back in from scratch. So let's get started. So let's take a look at our HTML code. can see that with this line, we are including a CSS file, which is right here. And in this file, we're defining things like font family and padding amounts and colors. And we can see that right below this line to include the CSS file, we're also including a couple JavaScript files. Now, you don't need to worry about memorizing this syntax. I will include a link to the source code after this video so you can copy and paste or learn at your own speed. But just know that in a similar fashion to attaching a CSS file to a page, we are attaching JavaScript files to the page. So in this file, script.js, we can include any JavaScript we want, and it will run when the page is loaded. So just as a proof of concept, just to prove that all the files are lined up, we can write alert hello world, and when we refresh the page, we see that there is an alert. Okay, so now that everything's plugged in and working correctly, our first task is to add the X to this yellow box so that it will close on click. Now, before we worry about writing the actual JavaScript, let's make sure we have the X in place visually. So we're going to head over to our HTML, find the corresponding div for this yellow box. Here it is, UI message. And let's add a class for the actual X button. So we could name this anything we want, but I've named it UI close. Put an X inside it, close the span. And let's remove this hello world message. So now if we refresh, we see that the X is there, and if we hover it over it, it gets dark. This just corresponds with a little bit of CSS that we have, basically giving it a background color and a little bit of padding. But this is a lesson on JavaScript. So now that we have our X, how do we make it so when you click on it, it does something? So let's head over to our script file and write our first bit of jQuery. I will explain this code in just one moment. Okay, jQuery is the world's most popular JavaScript library. You can think of a library as a giant set of shortcuts and tools that make writing JavaScript a lot easier. So inside this bracket and this bracket, we can write anything we want, and jQuery will help make it happen. So to show you just how simple it is to write jQuery, it's a two-step process. Number one, you select an element or a series of elements, and number two, you act on it. So for example, we want to select this X button. So we write UI close, and again, this is using CSS syntax to select the element, so it couldn't be easier. We know that a period corresponds with classes, and then we just include the name of the class, and then we want to act on that element. So we chain a method. So we'll say hide. Now this isn't what we want for the actual functionality, but it's a good proof of concept. So when I refresh the page, we see that it's gone. And we could use any method we want here. We could say fade out, and when we refresh, we see that it fades out. Or we could say slide up, and it will slide up. So we don't want any of that though. We want to use event handling. We want to write code so that when you click on this X, the entire yellow box disappears. And we're going to traverse the DOM to make that possible. But first, let's focus on a bit of event handling. The event that we want to hone in on is when this X button is clicked. So we'll write jQuery UI close. When it is clicked, we want to run a bit of code. Again, don't worry about memorizing this syntax perfectly right now. I will include a link to the source code after the video. But just know that any code we include inside these brackets will run when this gets clicked. So for example, we could say alert hello. And when the X button is clicked, we see that pops up. So what we want to write here is code that will hide the entire yellow box. And remember, if we hop over to our HTML, the entire box has a class of UI message. So we can write jQuery UI message hide. And if we click the X now, we see that it's gone. However, that hid every yellow box on the page, not just the one that we clicked on. So this is where DOM traversal comes into play. Remember the set of Russian stacking dolls? We needed to do a bit of hopping around all those different sets to select just the particular yellow box that we want. So let's erase this line, and before we write our new code, let's just discuss the logic that we want to use. We want to hone in on the specific X being clicked, and then move up its set of ancestors to find its particular surrounding box. So basically, we're going to hone in on this specific span, and then we want to move up the DOM tree a level to find the closest div named UI message. So the code that we'll write looks something like this. And if we refresh, we'll see that when I click this, it fades out just that yellow box. So let's dissect this line. We're saying this. This is a keyword in JavaScript and in jQuery that refers to the object that we're running the method on. So we're running the method click, the event handler, for this UI close element. So when we say this, it's referring to the specific element that got clicked on. And then we're saying from that element, look for its parents and look for an element with a class of UI message, and then fade it out. So that's the series of events that takes place. And that's an example of A, handling an event, the click event, and B, traversing the DOM. We found the element, we jumped up to its parents, so on and so forth. Let's show a quick example of manipulating the DOM. So for example, we noticed that this X button is only displaying on this first yellow box, and it's not on the second or third yellow box. That's because we only added it manually in the HTML to the first UI message div. So let's actually add it dynamically to all of the boxes with JavaScript. So I'm going to remove this from my HTML. So if we refresh, we see that it's gone. So now let's hop over to our JavaScript file, and we want to select the yellow boxes. And remember, they have a class of UI message. And we'll use this neat jQuery method called append. And we'll paste in the code that we used to have in our HTML. And when we refresh, we see that now we've manipulated the DOM, the giant family tree of Russian stacking dolls. We've used JavaScript to insert a bit of HTML markup in the exact places that we wanted it. And when we click, it only closes the box that we wanted it to close. So this is a good example now of event handling, traversing the DOM, manipulating the DOM. Hopefully things are starting to click a little bit. You're starting to see how useful JavaScript and jQuery really are. But practice makes perfect, so let's try another quick example. Let's give this frequently asked questions section a bit of attention. So what do we want to do? Basically, we want to hide all of the answers so that on page load we only show the questions, and then a user would tap or click on one of the questions to see the desired answer. So if we hop over back to our completed version, the cheat sheet, here it is in action. You click on one, you can click again to toggle it. Now you're interested maybe in this question. Okay, so it's pretty simple. Back to our version where we need to write the JavaScript. So let's get started. Our first bit of business would be to hide the answers initially. So we'll hop over to our JavaScript file. Let's actually clean this file up a little bit. Let's add inline comments, a little bit of documentation. So we start with 2 slashes, and then we can say, this line was for adding the X button, and this code was handling the click event. Get rid of a little bit of extra white space. Okay, and we'll add a new comment, and we'll call it initially hide the answers for the frequently asked questions section. Okay, so basically, let's hop over to our HTML, and we scroll down a little bit, and we see that each question and answer consists of a heading level 4 with the question, and then a div with a class of answer. So it's really simple. We just want to select the class of answer and hide it. So if we refresh, we see that now only the questions are displaying. So now we just need to write some code that handles the event of clicking on one of these headings. So we'll write a new line. We'll start with a comment, handling the fat question click. Okay, so we'll select the question. If we look at our HTML, we see that we have this parent class of FAQ, and then each question is just an H4 element. So we'll say fac H4, descendant selector. It's that easy to select it. And then we'll say on click. So on click we want to think of the Russian stacking doll example again, the DOM. On click, we want to move to the nearest following div with a class of answer, because we want to act on that particular bit of content. So we will say this, move to the next element that has a class of answer, and then slide it down. So when I click on this, we see that it slides down. When I click on this one, its answer slides down. Now watch this. Instead of slide down, if you say slide toggle, jQuery will automatically know that when you click it a second time, it should slide back up. So jQuery has a lot of neat little shortcuts like that for you. Now let's go the extra mile and style these headings so that they actually look like something that can be clicked instead of just plain text. Now, if a user has JavaScript disabled, obviously we don't want these to look like links. We want them to just look like plain text like this. But if this file is running, then JavaScript is obviously enabled. So we're going to write a new line of code, and we'll just say fac h4 add class. This will just add a class. Fac question. So if we refresh, we see that they're now blue, and they use the hand icon when I hover. This is corresponding with this class in our CSS file, fac question. We're just giving it a color of blue and using the pointer for the cursor. And that wraps up the frequently asked questions section. Now let's talk about the big picture of JavaScript. We mentioned that there were 4 primary uses. We've covered number 1, how to handle events. We've covered number 2, how to traverse the DOM. We've covered number 3, how to manipulate the DOM. And you'll remember that number 4 was this general idea of sending and or receiving data without refreshing the page, without a hard page reload. Well, that's the one topic that we haven't covered so far, so let's dive right in. You can see that if you click this Learn More box, it takes you to an entirely separate page. And if we look at our file structure, you can see that index was the file that we've been working with, and about is this entirely separate page. So let's imagine a scenario where we want to load in this content dynamically on the fly into this area on click. When you click Learn More, we want to pull that content in. Let's imagine that maybe this image of the bee is a really large graphic file, so it's a large file size, and we don't want to load it unless a user actually clicks to read more. So we want to pull it in on the fly. So let's start writing the code to make that possible. So we'll begin by targeting the click event for this Learn More link. So if we hop over to our HTML, we see that there is a element with an ID of about. So let's start writing our JavaScript. Give a comment, say dynamically load about content. Okay, so when that about link gets clicked, that's the event we're targeting, we want to run a bit of code. We want to target this div with the class of about placeholder. So if you see in our markup, we have a div with a class of about placeholder. We want to insert the code that we want dynamically into this element on the fly. So we're targeting about placeholder, and we're going to use jQuery's load method. We're going to go into this about HTML file. Let's pull it up really quickly. This is a new HTML file from the one we've been working with. Let me show it to you in the browser. And let's imagine that we only want this content from this page. We don't want any of this content. So in this new page, about.html, we scroll down and we find that this is what we want. This div with a class of body text. So back to our JavaScript. We're loading, using this load method, we're loading this file, and then we're going to say body text. So we're going inside a specific file, and then we're only taking the element that we want. And then finally, because JavaScript is enabled, when someone clicks this link, we don't want it to follow the link URL. We're just using it for the click event. So we'll say return false. So now if we refresh the page and we click on Learn More, it dynamically loads the content into the DOM of the current page. So not only did we manipulate the DOM, our giant set of Russian stacking dolls, we pulled in data from another source on the fly without a page reload or a page refresh. Only JavaScript can do that. And that's going to conclude this introductory video to JavaScript with jQuery. Let's review what we've learned. We've learned the role that JavaScript plays. HTML is for content, CSS controls the styling and appearance, and JavaScript controls the behavior. Now obviously there are a lot more than 4 uses for JavaScript, but we think of the big 4 as event handling, DOM traversal, DOM manipulation, and sending receiving data without page refreshes. Now obviously there's a lot more that you can do with JavaScript. We only scratched maybe 1 to 2% of its surface. If you can imagine it and it takes place in the web browser, it can likely be done with JavaScript. The point of this lesson was just to inform you of some of the basic concepts that sort of drive everything, and to provide you with a bit of basic vocabulary to help you learn more advanced JavaScript techniques. From here, the sky's the limit. You just need to learn a little bit more and create whatever you want to create. So thank you very much for watching. I hope you feel like you learned something, and stay tuned for more web development tutorials. Thanks. Bye.